How are we all doing tonight? They're snacks. Some of you have availed yourself. The rest of you, don't be shy. You've already paid for them. The student loan checks you take out, snacks. They're yours. So if you won't offend me, if at any point you get up and go grab some. I've already got some coffee here to keep me awake for my own lecture. So my name's Pastor Ben Morris. I use he, him pronouns. I am the pastor, if you know where the Common Ground building is, where Campus Threads is. I'm the Lutheran pastor there. I also teach in the religious studies and theology department at Viterbo. And if you came because you wanted to see the wonderful Dan Green or the brilliant Dr. Ariel Beaujot, I've got bad news for you. They are not going to make it tonight. So you're stuck with me. If you want to get up and leave, I won't feel bad. As we begin, part of the reason we're having this discussion tonight is centered around our land recognition statement. And I'm going to read that for you now. And this is also, it's in a lot of places on the university, and it's on lots of our websites here. So we would like to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Please take a moment to celebrate and honor this ancestral Ho-Chunk land and the sacred spaces of all indigenous peoples. So the whole theme that tonight's lecture was about is truth and reconciliation. And can you have reconciliation without truth? And the focus of tonight was brought about because of, in 2016, when the Native American Student Association, working with lots of various folks, decided that it was important to ask this university to adopt a land recognition statement. And this land recognition statements have been showing up in lots of places and in lots of spaces that are, geopolitically the result of white settler colonialism. If I have my history right, this practice has its roots in a welcome to home ceremony, which was part of the Australian Aboriginal justice movements. It was also just an older ceremony by which Aboriginals of one group would welcome others to their land in a recognition that, in these indigenous cultures, there's no sense of land ownership. There's a sense of land relationship. And from this Aboriginal movement, this idea has spread around the globe as a way of telling the truth. That if you are in a place whose history has been white settler colonialism, you are on indigenous land, occupied land. So back in 2016, when NASA did a lot of really hard, good work to get this done, and it's in tiny print. So NASA had crafted this statement along with folks at the time. It was Campus Climate. It is now, now I have the name wrong, Center for Transformative Justice. So there was a lot of work done on this, and it was passed by the Student Senate unanimously, and the Academic Staff Council near unanimously, the Faculty Senate, and the University Staff Council. All these adjudicating bodies on this campus said yes to this statement. And Chancellor Gao, along speaking the voice of the larger university system, said no to this statement, with the sticking point being the word occupies. There was a fear, at least this is what was spoken to the NASA students at the time, that by saying the word occupies, we would recognize reality. And by recognizing reality, there would be legal claims. The Ho-Chunk Nation was going to come and take this campus land back. At the time, Willie, who members of NASA called Choco-Willie, the Ho-Chunk word for uncle, Uncle Willie, who was the tribal chairman, sent a letter from the nation saying, this is not a legal thing. We are not going to make a court case. And in fact, what I will speak about today, especially when it applies to the doctrine of discovery and multiple Supreme Court cases, indigenous bodies aren't even able to make that claim. The highest court in the nation has on multiple occasions said that land cannot be re-sovereignized by indigenous nations. So there's no legal reason we can't use the word occupies, present perfect tense, right? So then what's it about? And then it comes to a head with the renaming of our arts building on campus. And what I would say is my piece, what I'm going to set up is the idea of an animating myth. And we're going to talk about what myth is, and that was my piece. Dan Green, who teaches here as a professor and is also a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, is an expert on the ways that Native American peoples are depicted and the harm done in those depictions. I first met Dan when we worked together on getting the large statue at Riverside Park removed, because that was a big, giant, as he called it, the Colossus of Kitsch, a harmful, stereotypical statue of Native peoples in one of the most beautiful places in our city. And what Dr. Ariel Beaujot was going to speak about would be participating on the academic level, on the boards and councils about the renaming of this building. So here's what I would say. I don't have the expertise on those things that Dan and Ariel do. So I'll say this, I'm not going to try to speak for them. I would say take one of Dan's classes, but I believe he's retiring at the end of this year. So, but he's got stuff like, go, if you YouTube him, there are actually, you're going to laugh at me for saying YouTube? This is my Lutheran students up front giving me crap. Please continue, old man, to use the internet terms wrongly. So if Dan Green has presentations about this stuff, and it's important, and you can get it directly from him. And I'm sure that there will be other ways that we can find out what a lot of the controversy about renaming this building is. But because that was not the part of the presentation that I was going to prepare, I know about it. But I don't want to speak for them because the issue is so important that the facts really need to be out there correctly. Cool? So you're just going to get my part of the presentation, but I promise I'll take up the entire hour and a half, okay? Cool? All right. So I want to begin by talking about the idea of an animating myth. And to do that, I want to talk about what the word myth is. Myth is a lot of things. So instead of trying to define myth, because it is a complex word, I'm going to tell you one thing that it's not. Myth is not what stupid pre-scientific revolution people thought about the world. Oftentimes, we're told that myths are what happens when people who did not yet have science had to figure out, well, why did the sun rise? What's the moon about? And they came up with stories because they were just too ignorant. And that's a really poor understanding of myth. The most powerful things that humans can do, the most powerful thing we do is we tell stories. Our stories allow us to make meaning, to bond together, to do things far greater than an individual can do. Myths create boundaries. Myths break down boundaries. Myth is how we make sense of the very deep mystery of existence. And here's the interesting thing about myth. Even science is a myth, in the sense that science helps us understand our place in the world and then make meaning from it. The more we learn about the natural world, we still have not been able to answer some of the deepest questions of humanity. The weird things that come with the general human experience. Who am I? Why am I here? What is this all about? So there's lots of ways that humans have, over the 2 million years we have existed on this planet, have made sense of the weirdness and the bizarreness of being alive. We tell stories. Now, we know that humans have gone through multiple revolutions in how we have evolved as both individuals and as social creatures. If you go back to the archaeological record, humans have always been spiritual and religious people. It's kind of part of the human experience. But an organized religion, we first see it showing up throughout history when we transcend the size of family groups. So little fun experiment. This is where you all get to pull out your phone. So pull out your phone. Some of you have been in my class at Viterbo. You know where I might be going with this. Open up your Instagram or your Facebook. I don't know how TikTok works because I'm 40. And I'm not sure I want to know. And I definitely stay away from Snapchat. That's all your thing. How many friends do you have? Or followers? How many people are you, like, friends, followers? How many people are you connected with on social media? Just start yelling out numbers for me. 500. 431. 100.
Well, I have 57 followers, but I'm following
1,822. How many people do you think you can know? 10. Noah's an introvert. Generally speaking, you can know about 200 people. That's about the human capacity for how many of you since coming to college have had friends drop out of your life? Right? How many of you felt bad about it? That's normal. But here's the reality. Sometimes people drop out of your life and you drop out of their life because you actually cannot maintain that many social connections. And so in human history, when we transcend that general 200, which is like a small village community, we need something more cohesive to hold us together. And at the agricultural revolution, which popped up in many different places around the globe and looked different where it happened, what happens when humans started gathering in larger groups, we see the start of a much more organized system of religion. We start telling stories because we need to transcend our small family units as ways to know each other. And religion provides a really interesting and it works. It's a way to bind people together so we can organize ourselves to do more, right? And part of that is what we'd call an animating myth. It's a story we tell. Like all myths, it's a vessel which contains truth, and it's animating. It allows us to do something. And this shows up, animating myths show up all over human society, and they rise and they fall. One thing I'd argue is as we look out at how our society feels like it's unraveling in a lot of ways, the animating myth, which has given energy to the thing we call America, is starting to fall apart. And some people, their response to that is anger and aggression, right? We saw this. This is what undergirds what the last 4 years have been like, because we have two parts of the country, it feels like. Some who see the dying of the animating myth that has kept most of us, not all of us, together, and they want to fight like hell for it. And others who are saying, well, yeah, because in the American animating myth, this is the greatest country on earth. This is the land of opportunity. If you work hard, you can make it. Right? This is a myth that bound most of America together, but in the middle of the 20th century, there were people who had been excluded from the animating myth, and their voices began to be heard by many. Actually, this country has never been a place of freedom for me and my people. Actually, my history of my people was enslavement. Your myth doesn't make sense to me. Or in the sense of indigenous America, well, that's not the myth at all. This is your myth is the one of the dispossession of my people of their land. And so America seems to have two things going on. We have the animating myth of people who want the old myth to continue to bind us together, and folks who are joining in, whether through the experience of living through the fallacy of that myth, or people who have a sympathetic ear and say, actually, that makes sense. Your story shows more truth than the story I grew up with. Is this making sense to you all? So I want to talk about the animating myths that have undergirded the white colonial settler experience. So there's a couple of them. There's the papal bull Inter Cetera, which we'll get into. You might not have heard of that. If you've been in one of my classes at Viterbo, you might have heard of that. How many of you have heard of Manifest Destiny? Okay, animating myth. The boarding school movement. How many of you have heard of that? That is coming more and more into the natural consciousness, thankfully. But first, I want to go back even farther than that. Before white settler colonialism. Way before that. Now, I'm a pastor. I'm a Lutheran Christian pastor. And I'm not here tonight to try to make you believe in the myth system that I adhere to. But what I think we can all agree on is that living here in this country, the mythic system of Christianity has undergirded the white settler colonial story since the first white settler colonists came here. And so knowledge of how this all came to be is helpful. I want to go all the way back to the really early story of Christianity. Because the early story of Christianity, it's interesting to think that the story of a man, Jesus, who grew up at the fringes of an empire, who then taught a nonviolent way of being to resist that empire and to flatten out a brutal socioeconomic structure, one based on sharing food and wealth and rejecting the myth of redemptive violence, which is a human myth in many, many cultures, that violence will save us. So this Jesus rejects that myth and tells a whole different set of stories to empower people to live in an alternative way of being to the imperial system. As a religious minority, as an ethnic minority, at the edge of this empire. How did this man's stories become the animating stories of the last 1,500 years of empire? So after Jesus dies as a criminal within the empire, a whole movement spreads up, and the story that we are telling is the story of resurrection. In Christianity, it spreads, and as it spreads through the Roman Empire, it initially spreads through marginalized communities. Because the story of give up all your wealth wouldn't be heard as good news. But the story of other people giving up their wealth to share would be good news to people on the margins, right? So Christianity spreads. And over time, it grows, and it becomes a challenge to the empire and its animating myth stories. And there's outbreaks of huge persecution against the Christian movement. Now, as the Roman Empire starts to decay, an emperor, Constantine, it would seem, is looking for something to give the empire a cohesiveness that it's starting to lose. And Christianity becomes a really great way to do this. In 315, Christianity is tolerated. Soon after, it's the official religion of the empire. Christianity moves from the margins of society, where it's meeting in homes, and it's telling liberating stories, and it moves into the center of society, where it's now bankrolled by the empire. Eventually, it becomes the only religion of the empire. But before that story happens, Christianity also moves to places where the empire never has held sway. And one of those places is the Western British Isles, what we'd call Wales today, and Ireland. And a Celtic form of Christianity starts to grow. And Celtic Christianity for a long time was a force to be reckoned with. The early Celtic missionaries that went to the British Isles went, and instead of the empire's way of demanding conversion, they had conversations with their own people. Celtic Christianity saw itself as an outgrowth of Druidic, Celtic, indigenous practice. The early priests shaved their heads like Druids, not the way that Roman priests would. Celtic Christianity was not based on domination. And around, this is where I have to look at my notes to get the dates right. There's a guy named Pelagius, 360. Pelagius is this Celtic Christian leader, and he goes to Rome, and he gets on the wrong side of a guy you might have heard of in a class named Augustine or Augustine. Augustine is a bishop in the empire. And he's arguing with Pelagius. Because one of the big issues is that Augustine wants to preach the entire depravity of human beings, that God is super mad at everybody. And Pelagius in this Celtic Christianity wants to say, actually, humans were created good. Not only that, but everything was created good. Everything is sacred. Humans are sacred, the trees are sacred, the earth is sacred, everything is sacred. Augustine wanted to preach what was called creation ex nihilo. God created the existence from nothing. And the Celtic Christians are saying God created creation from God's very own being. So everything that is just soaked in God's goodness and holiness. Well, we know who won this argument. Augustine. Pelagius was kicked out of the church as a heretic. And then the Pope said Pelagians couldn't come within 100 miles of Rome. And the next year he said Pelagians can't even come into Italy. And finally, about 200 years after that, the Pope authorizes a purge of Pelagians from the British Isles and Ireland. This will undergird everything that happens with white settler colonialism, because it's based on the idea that humans and creation are not sacred. Land, you can do whatever you want with land if you have power. You can do whatever you want with people if you have power. When Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, it rejects its own roots. It becomes an imperial religion. In 1492, and then you learned a lot of stuff in school, which I hope that this university is helping you unpack and realize that it's, I won't give the rhymes. But Europeans come to the realization that there's a whole world that they knew nothing about. In 1493, Pope, going to get it right. In 1493, Inter Cetera. I'm just going to bring this out here. A papal bull. A papal bull is when the Pope makes a declaration. So what had happened is Spain and Portugal are very much aware of this whole group of continents they didn't know existed. And the Pope basically says, well, anything west and south of 100 leagues of the Azore Islands will be Spain's. All of it. This is why today Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking nation. Anything east and south of that is Portuguese, so long as the people there are not Christian. So what this papal bull does is say that any land that is not occupied by Christian people can be split up between two nations. Now, not to be outdone, the Protestants who will develop 20 years later, they get in on the game. And in this colonial expansion, what we see is that with the undergirding myth that any place that doesn't have Christians already in it can be taken by European powers, this is exactly what European powers do. Through just a massive push of colonial expansion, the entire world will fall under the dominion of whoever can see it or touch it first. This is why the European newly early burgeoning nation states are bankrolling ships to go out. And it's not just the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English. This is why the Dutch and Swedes have these early claims. This is why Indonesia becomes a Dutch colony. This is why Africa gets split up. This is why, parts of China belong to Portugal. This is why Hong Kong was British, right? The entire world is allowed to be split up by Christian nations because they have an animating myth that tells them they can do so. It's not just available to them, it needs to happen. Because we have to save these people, and the only way we can save these people is to take their land and force them to be Christians. This is the full extent of this Augustinian and Pelagian debate, right? Because the world isn't sacred. People are not inherently good and sacred. This is how the religious movement of a person who lived and died as a criminal underneath an empire becomes the animating myth of take over anything. And that's what happens in what is going to become the country that we live in right now. Now, America, the United States of America, was colonized most successfully by Protestant nations, and eventually England, right? And then we know the history. Then there's another animating myth that comes up, that the people who lived in these British colonies should be free. We have this whole mythos of freedom, neglecting the fact that a gigantic amount of this nation are enslaved human beings, and that it's all happening on land that is ever being pushed westward at the dispossession of the indigenous people there. But they have a myth that allows them to feel okay about this, a myth that animates them, that gives them the right in their minds to do this. During the Napoleonic Wars, to raise money for Napoleon's conquests, he's going to sell French America, the Louisiana Purchase. Again, the idea that France can sell all the land between the Appalachian Mountains, basically, and the Mississippi River. It is just signed over from one nation to the other in some gold changes hand. But there are people who've been living here. And I'm not even going to undergird how long they've been living here, because the people who've been living here have their own stories of how they are here and how they relate to the place. So there's a clash of mythos. And as the United States of America spreads westward, it'll happen under another animating myth, manifest destiny. That it's the destiny of this nation to become a great empire. Remember, we're talking about a time period when the word empire wasn't a bad word. It was an aspiration. All the other great white nations are empires. The British Empire, the sun never sets on it. The Spanish Empire, the sun had started to set on it. But America saw itself, at least the white settler colonists and their descendants saw themselves as having a destiny that must be made manifest, a nation that stretches from ocean to ocean. And so that myth animates a whole series of atrocities. Indian Removal Act, under Jackson, 5 nations of the Southeast Most of us have probably heard about what happened with the Cherokee Nation, the Trail of Tears. As Anton Troyer will say, every single Native nation has experienced their own apocalypse, their own Trail of Tears story, including the Ho-Chunk of this part of the country who were removed multiple times and came back multiple times, not willing to give up on the land that they saw themselves belonging to. And so America manifested that destiny. It became a nation from coast to coast. And it became a nation of mass graves to get that job done. And then, an increasingly brutal reservation system. The goal of the reservation system, and you can read this stuff, the whole goal was that it was supposed to be so brutal that nobody could survive it long term. That people would either abandon it or they would just die and not be inconveniences anymore. And the life of people on reservations became just horrid. And so a progressive movement rose up. And I think it's important to name that because we also need to think about the animating myths behind progressive ideas. Look at what's happening on these reservations. How can we help these poor, dispossessed Indians? And the answer was education. The answer was boarding schools. Under the animating myth, save the man, kill the Indian. Boarding schools started as a progressive idea. Take Native children from their homes and educate them in Western white cultural ideals. Cutting their hair, forcing them to learn English, forcing Christianity onto them. This happened here. This happens in Canada. It happened in different places, the Aboriginal experience in Australia. This happens in multiple different places. This idea that we can educate indigenousness out of people. What we've seen in Canada with the excavations of boarding schools, thousands of mass graves. Under Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, we're going to be doing that work here in our country. And we're going to find just the same level of brutality, if not worse. There's a movie, Indian Boarding Schools, a survivor story. One of my best friends growing up, his mom she teaches at Eastern Michigan University. She's Choctaw. And they made this movie, and they're talking specifically to Michigan boarding school survivors. And I would recommend that. We're going to find the same things. And we know that because the stories of the people who've survived them are saying this. We don't need the archaeology. It will be helpful to show it all, but the stories are out there. So we've got these myths. We've got the myth of Christian empire. We've got the myth of this papal bull that says the world can just be split up between European powers because they're Christian and this is God's will. We've got the myth of manifest destiny, which is just a slightly more or secular version of the same thing. And now we have what we're living with on this campus. Indigenous students did a lot of hard work, a lot of painful work, a lot of emotional work, to ask for something that does not seem all that wild, does it? We would like to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people. The United States has signed over 200 treaties with Native nations. Only the federal government can sign treaties. The United States has broken every single treaty ever signed with an indigenous nation. Every single treaty. The treaties that were signed under great duress, at gunpoint. I don't think I am allowed to put a gun to your head and have you sign your house away to me, am I? That's under duress. But that's exactly what happened in this nation. Other indigenous groups just had their land taken even without having a treaty. We are on occupied land. That's uncomfortable, but it's true. And so the question is, can we have reconciliation without truth? After apartheid fell in South Africa, the recently deceased Archbishop Desmond Tutu convened a Truth and Reconciliation Committee so that those who were the perpetrators of apartheid rule and those who suffered under apartheid rule could both tell their stories. A nation that was going to heal from this needed a new animating myth. And it needed everybody's story to make this work. And so people who helped build the system of apartheid told the truth about the terrible things they did. And people who suffered under it told their stories of what it was like to live under that. That was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mark Charles, a Dene, or in the colonial language, Navajo Nation member, who ran for president a few years ago. Mark Charles, if you've not seen any of his work or read any of his work, amazing human being to listen to. Mark Charles calls us to maybe not even talk about the term reconciliation, because reconciled is to say we were one and we were torn apart. How do we come back together? But in the story that is the United States of America, we were never one. When a nation is founded, as Dr. Martin Luther King would say, on the twin sins of enslavement and genocide, you're never one nation when one group of people are brought here to be enslaved, and it's happening on land in which people have been forcibly pushed off of or killed to take. We need conciliation. We're at a critical moment in our nation's history where, for the first time, with so much mass media that we have access to, we can hear stories that have been suppressed for so long. If you are a person who is descendant of the white settler colonial experiment, you no longer have to buy into the animating myth and accept it as holding truth. You can hear the stories that challenge this. And if you're part of the story of this country that suffered under this myth, we live in an era where we get to hear those stories. And only when we hear all those stories can we start to tell the new story of us. I've worked on many reservations in my life. I am not an expert on any of this. But I can tell you that at no point has anybody ever told me that what they want is for me to go back to a European homeland. I mean, I have to go to 7 countries to do it, right? I mean, there's a recognition that we are all here now. The way that we all got here from the various points of the globe all happened differently. Some people, we have a statue on the East Coast to let in the Europeans. We didn't build a statue on the West Coast. We had laws against Chinese immigration, right? There's so many stories of how this place came to be and who made this country and how it was made. But I can tell you this, if myth is a vessel that can hold truth, and by holding that truth, we can be animated, if we have the courage in this country to speak and to listen, I'll be amazed, and our children's children will be amazed at what we can do if we're led by that truth. The last thing I'll say is the question about our arts building and the renaming. It doesn't matter how many buildings we rename. If we can't say the word occupies, which is true, then with respect to the people, and families for whom our buildings are named, we're not telling the truth. Indigenous students at this university have organized, risen up, and made a very reasonable demand. let's just tell the truth about whose land we're on and how this land came to be this university. So if you feel like this has spoken to you, contact the Native American Student Association and ask, how can I help amplify your voice so that the one place, the only place at the high end of this administration and the university system, help tell the story that the word occupies matters, because it's the only truthful word we can use for it. I would encourage you to seek out the work of Dan Green, brilliant, and Dr. Ariel Beaujot. She was going to tell you the story about how all this took place on the administration level, about the renaming of our building. And that is a story worth hearing too. I just can't tell it in its fullness, so I'm not going to try. Thank you for coming tonight. Do you have any questions, concerns, thoughts? Snack bar. Have at it. Thank you.